Okay, hi everyone. I just want to make a little video about the article I want you to read this week, titled From Influence to Impact, the Multifunctional Land Use in Mediterranean Prehistory Emerging from Palynology of Archaeological Sites. It's important to start understanding the science of sustainability because in your large essay you will need to use some type of scientific data like palynology, which is pollen counts, charcoal counts, tree ring counts, and so on. So you need to use something. But I thought this article would be a really good introduction to how to think about sustainability um, and the use of science. So now what I've done here, and I may just upload my particular article to our Blackboard course, because what I've done is I've highlighted important parts of this article that I really want you to concentrate on. So it starts off with the abstract, which is of course what the article is really about. So it's archaeobotany. So archaeo just means old, and botany, so the study of plants in the ancient world. That's really what it's about. Um, this particular article looks at 6 sites from Spain to Turkey, and then it looks at mostly pollen counts. It does look at charcoal for a bit, in terms of trying to figure out whether people were farming in this area and when they were farming, and in some cases what they were farming. So what we see in terms of the pollen count is they look at trees, crops, plants that pop up when the ground is broken up, and then they try and figure out what was actually happening during this period. And what we see is that if you look at pollen counts of trees, especially oaks, you can definitely tell that people were using the land in different ways. And in a lot of cases, they were cutting down too many trees, causing deforestation. And then what they ended up doing in these areas are planting cereal crops or grain, either in the site or around the site. And they've taken pollen counts from those different areas. And what they end up looking at is something called multiple land use, which is where you've got different activities like using trees, planting crops, and then having domesticated animals all within a certain land area. And then what I really like about this article is it talks about the lessons that can be learned from multifunctional land use by looking at what's happening in the ancient world. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole entire article with you. I really want you to focus on reading it and really trying to understand what it's talking about. I've highlighted a few places that I think are important. I just mentioned that what they're going to do is look at 6 sites. They compare something called on-site areas, which is like where people were living, and off-site meaning the land that they were using for other things that they weren't necessarily living on. So what they call, you might think about the difference between local and then regional use of land. The article goes in a little bit of issues about using pollen and some, whether you can get pollen counts from certain areas and so on. What I've also done in this article is if there are words that I think people may not be familiar with, I've highlighted them and then I've left a little comment. So taphonomical means related to fossils. So they're looking at fossilized pollen remains, which is really what it's talking about. And then the article goes into something called the API, the anthropogenic pollen indicators. Now, anthro means people. So pollen indicators that indicate people using the land. That's really what it's talking about. And you have to be careful with some of these abbreviations. So you've got API, the anthropogenic pollen indicator. You also have AP, which is arboreal pollen or pollen from trees. So what I tend to do is I'm reading through these articles. If I don't understand something, I just pop it into a Google search and have the definition come up. So I've done that here. And then other abbreviations, OJC, Olea are evergreens, juglans is walnut, and castagna is chestnut. And when you get these type of pollens, it seems to indicate that people are using the land. And then you've got cereal types. And as they indicate, many cereals are low pollen producers, meaning they're hard to find. But when you do find them, it's probably telling you that the people were definitely planting plants here. And as they say on page 832, high percentages of this pollen can be regarded as a good indicator of grasslands used for pasture in land use reconstructions. And then you get the aim of the article, how pollen indicators may be used to reconstruct how people are using the land. And let me skip down here in terms of the case studies. So these case studies are really interesting. I want you to spend a bit of time looking at them. They're fairly short in terms of what they go over for each site. So this site, La Draga, so it tells you where it is. It's in Spain. It tells you when, the early Neolithic. Now these are before present times. So 7270, we'll just subtract 2000, so about 5000 BC, if you want to think about it like that. But I would think about it in terms of before present, because this is what the article is talking about. It talks about, what kind of settlement sites you are, what kind of samples they use in their discussion. And then what I really like is they give a little summary at the end of this. So as you read through this, it tells you a little bit about the plants that are being discovered. As you can see here down at the bottom, we can tell from the pollen that oak was used for firewood and then for construction, because they found over 1,000 oak posts in a fairly small excavated area. And so considering the size of the entire site, thousands of oak poles must have been cut down. So you're talking about cutting trees down. And then, now this isn't in this particular article, but they do mention that there's soil erosion. So if you want to read about soil erosion in this particular site, go to this Revelle and others, dated 2016 in the bibliography, and you can read about their studies in soil erosion. And then it says you could see the soil erosion 500 meters from the archaeological site. There's a high presence of cereal pollen, so they're definitely growing cereals and so on. And then down at the end, it says, in their summary, when you compare pollen counts, farming itself caused a limited impact locally, and that firewood and timber supply was mainly the main mover and shaker in terms of how they changed the land. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but they do the same thing. Where the area they're studying is, what they're looking at, and then the summaries. So let me skip down here. Now, as you look through this, you'll see a lot of the science being used in these charts. Now, you're looking at a PDF, so what you need to do is go up to View, and then Rotate View. Let's see, I need to rotate it that way so that the chart looks normal and you can read it straight on. So this is figure 2. It shows the percent of pollen in 6 archaeological sites. And so in A and B, so here's A, here's B, they're looking at overall pollen counts. When you look at C and D, here's C, and there's D. Here you're looking at something called quercus, and I put here, these are oak pollen. And what I'll do in just a second, excuse me, I will take these apart and show you what all of them mean. But in general, what you're looking at is the time frame is here, so where it says chronology. And then don't worry about these so much, but what you're looking at is about 8,000 when they do the pollen counts. You see a little peak here, and then over time the pollen counts for tree pollen goes down quite a bit by around 7,000 before present. And then what you've got here is, this is the site of La Draga in Spain. They've taken 3 areas where they're pulling their data from: the west, west number 2, and south. And then you've got other sites here, which we don't need to go into right now. Now let me flip my PDF back so I can read it. And then this chart here, I'll go over this in a little bit more detail. This is charcoal charts. So you get charcoal when you burn trees, and then scientists can collect this charcoal, figure out what the trees are, like what kind of trees they are, and possibly where they're coming from. So I'll go over this in just a bit. But as you can see, there's a lot going on in each of these sites. And so I need you to read through and really understand. You might have to take notes on what they're talking about. And I will go through this chart here in just a bit. This is showing pollen diagrams from all 6 sites. And they're looking at the OJC, so I just went over those. Evergreens, walnuts, and chestnuts, their pollen. And then comparing them to cereals and chicory. Those are plants that tend to come up when the ground is broken up. So they pull that different pollen, and I've got a document here in just a second. I'll go through some of these. Anyway, when you get down to page 838, you'll get the results and discussion, where they'll pull all this data together and talk about the trends that they're seeing. And then the last section of the article, well, it's not quite the end, but close to the end, they're going to talk about land use, what all this data can tell us about what is happening. Again, more data. Let me just scoot down to the end here. When you get to the conclusion is where they wrap up everything. And you can see my little notes here, especially at the end where it says, what can we learn from all this? So the lesson from the past is that multifunctional land use is more sustainable than monoculture and is a promising way to develop the rural economy. So here's the lesson for today. Monoculture, meaning planting one crop in a large area, is probably not the best and is not sustainable. We can look at the ancient world to find out how they used their land, which is multifunctional, meaning they had trees like chestnuts or walnuts. They were probably growing them for the nuts. They had pasture land, and then they had farmland, all in a fairly small area. So that's the lesson. Okay, let me just switch to this document here. This is some of the data that I've pulled, and I've made the charts look a little bit different than what they are in the article. So let me make sure I can write. Okay, I can write. So I've just pulled out the information for La Draga in Spain. So AP, arboreal pollen or tree pollen in La Draga. So what you're looking at here, so if you look at here, this is 8,000 before present. And what you've got around 8,000 before present is a peak of arboreal pollen or tree pollen. And you can see over time, the trend is that it gets reduced around 7,000 BC. You get a bit of an uptick around 6,000, and then it goes down again around 5,000. Now this is in La Draga West. So what they've done is they've looked at arboreal pollen in La Draga in West, in the second section of West. They find similar trends. So a high point for tree pollen here, pretty drastic drop, a little bit before 7,000, goes up a bit, and then drops, and then sort of continues its downward trend. And then the same type of trend you see in the south of La Draga. Now, what I've done is I've cut this chart up, and I've made a new comparison where we can look at oak pollen. So if you look here again, you've got around 8,000. So I've tried to line these time scales up. You see oak pollen at a peak here, and then it starts to drop here, and then it really starts to drop around 7,000. Now look at this. So if you compare these two, just a little after 7,000, you have a drop in the tree pollen here, and then quite the drop in oak pollen around 7,000. So they're doing something with their trees. And what the oak pollen is telling us in particular is that they're cutting down oak trees because you've got fewer pollen grains to count. And then you can look at all these, you can look at West 2 and South and so on. So this is how you'd read these charts, and this is how they're pulling their data. Okay, let's look at this chart. Now again, I've moved these charts around from the article. So, in C, which is here, I pulled the same from the same site, La Draga. You're looking at cereal pollen, and then the pollen for plants that tend to be growing after you break up the ground. So in this case, it's a good indicator for grasslands used for pasture. Now, look around 7,000. So around 7,000 now in West for cereals, you've got just a little bit going on here. Maybe a little peak here. But look at this here. Now this, if you go up here, it's the grassland pollen. So you've got hardly any here. Over time, as the settlement is growing, all of a sudden you have a peak where they're probably using grasslands. Now, in just a second, I will pop this chart up next to the tree pollen, and you'll see what's going on. But I'll tell you right now, they're cutting their trees down. They've cut quite a bit, around 7,000, if you remember from what I just talked about. And then you get a peak of grassland pollen. So they're cutting their trees down, and they're planting grasses for animals to eat. Or when you look at West 2, you've got an increase in cereal pollen. So again, if you compare it to the tree pollen, the trees are being cut down, but the amount of pollen for cereals is going up. And then you see these trends. And then what I've also pulled in this A here is the Ojc pollen, so the evergreen, the walnut, and the chestnut pollen. Now you do see little peaks. So you see a little peak around 7,000. You see a bigger peak here, and then another peak here. What this is probably indicating is that they're starting to grow these particular trees, especially walnut and chestnut, because you can eat the nuts. So they're not only cutting trees down like oak, they're also planting trees, these particular ones. And I put what this stands for. And then what I've done here is I've put up, again, I've reorganized these charts. This is the same one we just looked at, arboreal or tree pollen at La Draga, and then I compare it to the cereals. So here again, you've got the downward trend. They're cutting their trees down. Around the same time you get the downward trend in the tree pollen, you get an uptick in cereal pollen. You can see it here and so on. So, and pasture land, because this is what this is indicating. So they're cutting their trees down, and they're probably in the same place. They're growing cereal crops like grain and pasture crops for animals. Okay, and then the last one I want to show you here is about charcoal. So this is oak pollen, and this is, sorry, it's just barely off your screen. Aslantepe, which is in Turkey. What they're pulling here in this chart is something we've already looked at for La Draga with the oak pollen, and you can see they're cutting their trees down. Now, Aslantepe is a slightly later site, which is why you're getting sort of a small. Now you can't see it. I'm sorry. This number here should be a 5. So if you look here, you've got 40. So if you think about 5, you're about down here on this particular scale. They've just blown it up here. You do get a little uptick in oak pollen around 4,500 if you go across and make a line, about 4,500. But there's not very much oak just based on the scale of things. Again, this is 5. Here you've got 40. So they've got a little bit of oak. Now what's interesting here is they show charcoal information. So you've got charcoal evidence. Now this is from Aslantepe, so it's the same place where they don't have a lot of oak. But what you see here is these are the various phases of this particular site. And then what they do is they look for charcoal data to see what type of trees, for example, are found in this area. And what you find predominant is, if you remember this particular word, it means oak. So look at what you can really do, just really simply, is make sure you're in the right scale for looking at these things. But you can see that this number is 80, this number is 40, this is 20, this is 40. But by far, this scale is bigger. So when you see a line like this, it's telling you that during this particular phase of the site, you've got a lot of oak charcoal being used. So what that means is they're cutting down a lot of oak, and that's what they're using for burning. And then, you can look at the other ones, look up what all these different types of trees are. But this is just one example of how you can read a chart that's about charcoal. Okay, so I'm hoping that this will help you in terms of understanding how science is used to help us determine what's going on in terms of sustainability in the ancient world.